Okay, welcome back to more author interviews at Crystal Lake. And today we are spotlighting the Dark Tide 18 anthology, Blood and Bullets. And we have two of the authors here with us, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So take it away. We'll start with Michael.
I'm Michael Knost, a two-time Bram Stoker Award-winning editor and author, and been in the writing industry. It seems like forever, and I had the opportunity to do this project, and it was kind of a dream because I love, love, love the Western genre.
Okay, and Keith.
Yeah. My name's Keith Lansdale. I literally grew up in this writing world when I was everybody else's kind of knee high. But I have written comics, I have written short stories, novels. I've got some movies made. Continuously trying to add to that pile. So this is a fantastic addition, and I'm really happy with it.
Okay, so how did you get involved in the project?
Um, so Joe sent me an email kind of way back, just wanting to know if I had any interest in doing something. And I had already thought about an idea that I wanted to do a little bit of something with. So I was like, "This is perfect. This is exactly what I want to find a home for." So yeah, I'm in, and that was the start of it.
Okay, so how'd you get involved, Michael?
Pretty much the same way. It actually started out with Joe and another writer, and I ended up I wasn't able to do it right away after committing to do it. I had my novel Return of the Mothman was being turned into a film, and so I was really busy with that, and I didn't want to drop the ball on James, and so what I did was I just told him, hey, find someone else, and of course, um, then later, I he and I were talking, and I said, the story that I was talking about, I'm still writing, and I'm almost done with it, and he said, well, it just so happens, and that the other writer was not able to do it, and so that's um, that's how he asked if I would go ahead and do it, and I said yeah. So, and I found out that Keith was in it, and that made it even better. I've never met Keith before, but I've known his dad forever and ever and ever, and so I said if the words go through the bloodline, we don't have anything to worry about.
Okay, so give everyone an overview of what each of your novellas is about. So we'll start with Michael.
Mine is about Jack McCall. It's this is the historically the man who killed Wild Bill Hickok, and came up behind him during a card game, shot him in the back of the head, and we know a lot of things about that death. We know, and many of it is just untrue, speculation and stuff like that. They talk about the aces and eights, the dead man's hands, and that's what he held. And most researchers and historians don't believe that that is true. And uh, the saloon in Deadwood today has a chair that's hanging over the door when you walk in, and it's supposed to be the death chair that he was murdered in. And no one takes into consideration the six fires that happened between his death and today, and also that it's a chair with a back on it, and eyewitnesses had said that it was a stool that he sat on. But all of those are speculations, and what I did was he was known as Broke Nose Jack McCall, and there was a doctor that had said that his nose was broken because he was pistol whipped in the face with a six shooter. and so pretty rough, pretty bad. And so I started speculating on, well, what if he had brain trauma, and what if that brain trauma caused him to hallucinate and to get paranoia. And so once he gets hit in the face in my story, he starts seeing this entity who is um, giving him an offer. Uh, and he makes a deal with him, and he tells him if he kills someone for him specifically, he'll make him bulletproof. And so we go throughout the story where this mysterious figure shows up from time to time, and that's pretty much how the story goes, and it stays pretty much 100% accurate historically, except for that dark, mysterious figure that shows up. And in the end, I'm hoping that the reader will look at it and go, "Gosh, I wonder if that really is a mental health issue, or did he make a deal with the devil, or whatever."
Yeah, well, that's the best kind of horror, the kind that says, "Is it real or isn't it real?"
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so Keith, what's your novella about?
Yeah, so mine's about a snake oil salesman kind of in the early 1900s. When we think of snake oil salesman these days, we kind of put it with con artists, but during that time, it was a little bit kind of ambiguous. Somebody could have been a shyster, or maybe they had something that they were just traveling town to town with trying to do. And so I've got a character there who is our snake oil salesman who he's kind of an unreliable narrator in some ways because you don't know if he's running the con or if he's very legit. But as the story goes on, he turns out to obviously usually be the fastest talker in the room. People start to think he's the smartest person in the room, and it ends up getting him in over his head. And before he knows it, he is trying to solve a mystery, and his life and the people that are with him's lives are at stake. So he is doing his best with a reputation that he really can't hold up to.
Yeah, that's generally how unreliable narrators go too. So what were the inspirations behind your stories, Keith?
Yeah, so I originally just had an idea that I wanted to do something with a snake oil salesman character. I've always kind of thought that's a fun character to play with, and so I had some idea that I didn't end up writing, but I had this character in it that I kept playing with in my head, and I kept thinking this would be kind of fun. And I played with different sort of scenarios, but as I sat down to start writing my story, the original idea I had sort of went away. That's the way that works very often for me. And I found a different story kind of finding its way into my subconscious as I was writing it. And as I was going through it, it was something that I realized, oh, I like this much better. So that was kind of how mine ended up happening.
Yeah, and Michael, of course, we know that Hickok was part of the inspiration, but what
Oh
other
yeah.
inspirations did you have?
Well, you know, I'm actually trying to make a crossover into the Western genre. Anyway, as far as traditional westerns, and just turned in a new novel to my agent today, and so I thought this would be a really good, kind of a transfer over where you have the speculation, the speculative fiction that goes along with it. And but yeah, like you say, the Wild Bill Hickok thing is just, anytime that you start thinking about the Prince of Pistoliers, it's it's a very famous event that we really don't know a whole lot about, and and almost nothing about the guy who killed him. And so I I started doing some research, and this was before even thinking about doing a story. And I think the research probably pulled me in much faster than anything else.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Research is very inspiring to a lot of stories, I tell you.
Yeah, but you got to be careful because you don't want to use that all of that research either. You just want to
Mm.
use the little bit that is necessary. But knowing all of it is good though.
Yeah, yeah. Research is like those iceberg memes,
Yeah,
the little bit on top goes in the story and the big chunk on the bottom is everything you do.
yeah.
So, the anthology does have a Western theme as well as a horror or a theme. So, are you a fan of Westerns, or is it a new genre for you? We'll start with Michael.
Well, like I just said, I'm kind of transferring over to the Western, and I've always loved it. I became an avid reader since the fifth grade. I had a teacher who challenged me and gave me a science fiction book. It was a classic science fiction book, and I never read anything that I liked. It was always everything that I read was something that I had to read. And he had that, and then he then later what he did was he gave me that book, and he said, all I want you to do is just have a conversation with me about it. And we did after I finished reading it, and I was hooked, and he knew. And so whenever while I was reading that book, he told me that I wouldn't have any homework that all the other kids would have. So that was, and I didn't have to do any book reports or anything like that. So he really knew how to get me. And when I was finished with that book, he he got this big grin on his face, and he goes out to his vehicle, and he comes back with a big box filled with these books. And he said, "This is what you're doing for the rest of the year. If you're reading these and we're having our conversations, uh, there's no homework for you that everybody else has to do." And so I started reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy and horror and westerns. And I found some westerns that just absolutely amazed me. And so I've been a huge fan since the fifth grade of all those genres.
Okay, what about you, Keith? Are you a Western fan or is it a new genre?
Well, I've always been a Western fan. I mean, I've watched a lot of Westerns, I've read some Westerns, but I essentially got here because I was on a panel for a zombie movie that I had written. And on that panel were some other people that were writing a horror Western, a movie. And they said, "Hey, we've got this idea and we just haven't been able to make it work yet. We're hoping maybe you'd lend some time." So I said, "Sure." Took the script, worked on that for a little while, and a year later, we're filming what is now The Pale Door, a horror western. So it was my first real step into the horror western genre was writing that Pale Door script. After that, I certainly enjoyed the idea of writing in that world because there's a lot of stuff in the western genre that's very interesting. Some different sort of like it's the blueprint for a lot of different things. You can take the isolation of small towns and add in horror very easily, right? Because
Mm.
that's that same sort of you're on your own that a lot of horror movies essentially are trying to grab. There's also that whole good versus evil, which is what a lot of those old traditional westerns really boil down to, which very easily also is something that you can add a horror element and go from there. So I've always been a fan of westerns, but I think westerns are kind of everywhere. I think it'd be hard not to be a fan of westerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I watched a lot of Western TV shows when I was growing up too. So, uh, what sort of Western tropes did you play with, and how did you mix them in with your supernatural horror elements?
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, essentially rolling out of what I was just saying. There's the aspects of that good versus evil. That there is a isolation. Those are the tropes that are usually somebody has got to stand up to the big bad.
Mm.
Now, in a western that's traditional, that may just be the guy wearing the black hat. But in the more horror and weird world, that can be the whole different slew of ideas, right? It can be anything. So I definitely played with those tropes that are, like I said, frameworks for a lot of different things.
Okay, so what about you, Michael? What Western tropes did you play with and how'd you mix in the horror?
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree 100% with Keith on that, and I go back to saying over time I learned that westerns, and Keith really nailed it. Um, Westerns are not just guys out on horses with cowboy hats and so forth. I mean, if you look at it, Star Wars is a wonderful western. So Mandalorian, oh my gosh, probably one of the best westerns that's come out in a long, long, long time. So those tropes, of good and evil. I like the isolation aspects as well, and also talking about it's almost like the Wild West is a haunted house if you think about it because of that isolation and Alien, the movie Alien being a big haunted house in space, and so those tropes kind of mix over with one another, and I think that's really interesting to be able to play with. But the good and evil, and then also to find common that commonality of the human element throughout the whole thing is what really intrigued me, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Mandalorian because the space cowboy genre is very fun because I mean you've got Firefly and you've got Cowboy Bebop too is part of that as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So now how deep did you go with the research for your novellas? Because I know you incorporated a real life figure, and the James, the other author, who's not here with us today, he also incorporated a real life figure, H. Holmes, one of my interests. So, how deep did you go with your research? And for Keith, why did you consider adding real life figures, or why not? Why did you go with not? So we'll
Yeah,
start with Keith.
I was going to say, who do you want to start here?
We'll start with Keith.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's anything that was really one way or the other on should I use something like that. But as I said, the story kind of came from this idea of my character, the snake oil salesman character. So it's not that I couldn't have incorporated real people, but sometimes if that's not the focus, it feels a little gimmicky. So I instead really wanted to tell the story that, well, the story I wanted to tell didn't end up happening. Like I said, I found a better one. But as I got into it, I really liked the story of my character, Elijah.
Okay, so what about you, Michael? You touched on this a little bit earlier about the research, but um, why did you decide to go with the real life figure?
Well, like I said, I think that was, from the research that I was doing, pretty much sparked me into wanting to do the story itself. And because of the fact of doing real life figures, you have to be really, really careful. For one thing, you have to know um, everything before you go into it. I've always said in science fiction, if you're writing science fiction, you have to be really careful, or that's what it was whenever I first started, at least, because 80% or so of your readership going to be scientists, and they're going to grill you if you screw up an element of science. And the same goes with westerns. 80% of readership in westerns are historians, and you get any element of history wrong, whether it's factual characters or not. Keith had this to deal with just as much as James or I, and that's you have to make sure that everything that you write is accurate to that period, no matter what. So, in my estimation, the period is just as much of a true character from back in the day as anything else. So, and this is coming from someone who's written horror for a long, long time. And this was the scariest story that I've ever written, and not because of the elements that was in it. It was I was terrified that I was going to screw up, and friends of mine who are enormous Western writers, Johnny Boggs, reading it and going, "Have you lost your mind, son?" You know, so. But the historical elements, and the thing that I did was I took several historical figures and put them on the page, and probably in real life their paths never crossed. And so that was something else that I really enjoyed doing, was taking research from so many things, but they were still in the same time frame, and tied a lot of things together historically. And I had a lot of friends who were in the western field who told me I never would have dreamed of being able to tie all of that together. And I was like, well, I didn't either, until you get in the thick of the writing of it, and then you're like, oh, this will be good with this. So
Yeah, that's the fun of writing historical fiction of any kind, because I write a lot of historical fantasies. So, yeah, you have to be very careful on the history, and you get to play with it. So it's
yeah.
okay. So, what were some of the most difficult parts of writing the story? Did you get stuck on anything while you were writing? And we'll start with Michael.
No, I don't think I ever really got stuck. It's my biggest thing is uh, time, making the time to get it done. And I had other things that were going on, and I've managed radio and television stations for 35 years, and so typically I stay really, really busy. And But I no longer work in broadcasting. I work for actually a community college in my hometown now. So now I have some more time. And but as far as any elements, I think probably the only thing that would have slowed me down would have been those. Every time that I would write a particular word, I would look it up. Was this word actually used during that time frame? So I think that probably was, the the thing that made me balk at the story itself. But it wasn't the story elements. It was more, was this word accurate? Was this an actual? What were they actually using this rifle at this time period, or was this later, or whatever?
Yeah, I know that feeling too. I've done that a couple of times, especially when because I write in England as a setting a lot. So I've got to did they use that word and did they use that word in England? Because
Right.
you got yeah. So what about you, Keith? Did you have any issues when you were writing the story?
Well, I definitely have a Google history search that looks very similar to, yeah, same sort of thing. Just like trying to figure out, all right, when did this phrase come into being? When did this word come into being? And making sure that I wasn't dropping anything that would stand out as, ooh, that's not right. So hopefully I got them all. I know that there's probably never 100% perfect, but I certainly made an effort. So I'm going to pretend there is until somebody tells me otherwise. But no, the only part that I ever had was when I got near the ending. I had an ending in mind the entire time I was kind of working towards it, and then when I got there, I said, "Ooh, I don't really want this ending. I don't think this works." And so I sat on an idea for a really long time trying to find what my ending was, because my problem was is that it was an ending, but it wasn't the poetic ending I was looking for. And then one day I was stuck in traffic in Fort Worth. I was surrounded by orange construction cones, and all of a sudden it hit me. I was like, I know my ending. And so I made a bunch of notes right there. As luckily I was stopped, literally sitting on the highway, typing on my phone. And when I got home, I put it to work.
Yeah, it's always the strange places where
Yep.
the solutions come,
It is.
isn't it?
It is. I had going back to talking about the research and so forth. I had a really good friend who is an enormous award-winning writer, to read the story for me, and he's a Western genre writer, traditional. And I told him, I said, the only thing I want is you to find anything that's inaccurate in the history and so forth. And so he read it and he said, no, he said, everything is great. He said, the only thing that I would say is you mentioned bale of hay. And he said, there were no bales of hay at that time period.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so that I didn't even think of that. And I started researching and he was correct. They were coming up with a baler um, around that time, but it would not have been, uh,
Hmm.
you know, widespread or whatever. So that I guess probably helped keep me from getting embarrassed when somebody reads it later and goes, "Hey, he doesn't know what he's talking about."
Yeah. No, I probably wouldn't have caught that either. Yeah, I mean, a bale of hay just feels so like what it is.
Yeah,
But yeah, you're right. The baler wasn't around, so
right. Yep.
yeah, that's a good catch by him. I don't know if I'd have caught that myself.
Yeah, well, I'll never make that mistake again. So,
Well, I won't either now. So
yeah, I
thanks
know.
for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Keith.
Yeah, none of the people who write historical fiction will make that mistake after watching this, so
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, what were your favorite parts of writing this story? Is there a scene or a character that stands out for you? And we'll start with Keith.
Well, I would say that that ending when it hit me, and I'm going to be very very careful not to drop spoilers here, but there's a lot of different elements with the way my character, his motivations, and as you get into it, you realize that there's a whole lot of layered stuff going on, and some of it actually mimics certain things that are going on with my family and that sort of stuff in a way that's, obviously it's going to be very different, but from myself there were some correlations, and like I said, I'm trying to be very vague, so sorry, but I didn't realize how emotionally tied I was to that ending, which is why it was such a beautiful ending for me. Because there's, well, without getting into too much detail, my mother has some health issues, things like that, and a lot of that came out in the story, and especially near the ending. And it didn't dawn on me when I was writing it, which I think is the right thing. But as I was reading it out loud to my fiance, I was reading, it was my story, and I realized that I was getting choked up as I was reading it. I was like, why am I so emotional? And then, and then I realized, oh, this is all that cathartic that I needed right here. So yeah, there's a whole lot of my family and my heart that are in that ending. So it meant a lot to me, and it was nice because I didn't tell people that who I let kind of get a glance at it, and they both picked up on it immediately, like, oh, I see this, because they know the things that are going on in my life. So it was wonderful that that happened because it was a very happy accident.
Okay, so what about you, Michael? What's your favorite part of your story?
You would think that I would say that writing, Wild Bill Hickok would have been my answer, but it's not. And I think I was really intrigued with writing someone who we know is the murderer of this icon. Um, and how can I make the reader sympathetic to this guy? And and we don't know his story anyway, and so that's what I pretty much was doing, was trying to give the reader his story and his background, and then also trying to my whole thing was I was trying to write a character that every person reading would go, "Oh my God, that sounds like me," except for killing somebody. And eh, but the struggles that he was going through, were struggles that I wanted everyone to feel and be able to think to themselves, gosh, I understand exactly where he's coming from. And so I think I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed, and also showing the differences between with what was going on in his mind before and after the 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 injury to the face, and subtle things that the reader could hopefully pick up on.
Sounds interesting. So, what is it about horror or westerns in general that calls to you as a writer? And I'll start with Michael.
That caused what?
Calls to you as a writer.
Oh, calls to me. Uh, you know, I forget now who it was that said it, and it may have been Joe Hill that had mentioned that when it comes to horror, it's not about the monsters, it's about the people that are affected. And I think the Western genre is very much like that as well. And I love that aspect. It's not about how scary the big bad is. It's about the sympathy and the empathy that the reader or me, uh, you know, give to the character that's suffering and going through it. I believe this. I believe that the reader connects to the story through uh, the main characters, and they live vicariously there. And so, without that connection, they don't connect to the story. And so, that's the reason why that sympathy and empathy is so important with the characters that your reader has to go through. Because without that, your story, it doesn't hit home at all. And Keith was talking about getting choked up when he was reading certain parts and stuff. And Keith, you need to know this, that um, that that is something that is transferable, because you feel it when you wrote it, and whenever you read it, readers are going to feel that as well. And that is, to me, I think is so important. And I don't believe that any other genre than horror or western can do that any better.
Mm, well, that's well said. So, Keith, what about you? What does horror or westerns have an appeal for you?
Yeah, I mean, part of that's just what I was talking about before. It's such a good kind of blueprint or framework to a good story. It's good versus bad, and kind of to echo what Michael was just talking about. Yeah, nobody really cares about, you know, you talked about Alien at one point, or Aliens. It doesn't matter. They're both the same point I'm trying to make. But you're right on that. That nobody really cares about the alien. You care about the people that are going through it, and it doesn't matter
Yep.
what story you take, because I've mentioned this before. I wrote a zombie movie previously, but if you really wanted to, you could take the zombies out and make it some sort of a natural disaster, and it'd be essentially the same sort of idea, because it has to do with people in a situation and they're
Yep.
trying to survive.
Yep.
And they're cut off from society, which is that perfect way to work that Western element in there, because there is no, I'll just, call down the road, or I'll call the police. It's more, it's usually the sheriff is one of the people that's in the story already, and that's that. They're the one. If they can't handle it, they'll pin that star on somebody else next week. So it's essentially the same sort of idea, where that story can be told many different ways. The creature is just that reason that they're trying to survive. So you've got that horror element, but then the Western plays perfectly into it. Like I said, no cell phones, no help. You are on your own. So I think that's just something that really plays well into fun stories that are kind of like, oh no, how would I get out of this?
Yeah. And I agree. And to add to that, one of the things that I love to do is also, I like to create a parallel with the main characters and the plot. So there's an internal struggle that's going on that kind of parallels with what's going on, within the story itself. And Keith alluded to that, and I agree. I think whenever you can tie those two together, uh, what you're showing that's going on the outside, the reader kind of realizes that's things that are going on the inside as well. And I think that's so important.
Mm,
Yeah, absolutely.
definitely. So, what are you currently working on, and what can readers expect from you next? And we'll start with Keith.
I got a few things. I actually we just dropped, and I say just it's been about a month now, but we just dropped a collection, or I guess it's an anthology. It's called About That Snowy Evening, and it is a collection of original poetry, like classic poetry, but then short stories that were inspired by different poetry. I also did one in there myself. Even though I helped edit it, because originally I was brought on as to write it, and so I did one for Ozymandias, the poet Paul Ozymandias, and so I wrote a story that was that. But then as time went on, I also got to help edit it and kind of help get it to the end where we've got it now available. So that's fun. And even if you don't like poetry, don't worry. The stories in there are not poetry. I can't write poetry. Poetry's hard. But what I do like is the ideas that came out of it. I've also we're about to start seeing some drops. I had a actually another weird Western type situation that is called Red Range. That's a four-part comic that was originally going to drop, but then the original person making it, he actually died. So we're now resorted out. I'm about to start dropping that. Very excited about that. And me and my dad just did a story together called Coat Check that is going to be in a Hitchcock anthology. And so that was really fun. I always get to have a lot of fun when I write with dad because he and I have a lot of the same kind of how we think. So it works out really well. He's the easiest one for me to write with.
Okay, so what about you, Michael? What's coming up next for you?
In December, I have it's a standalone of the story that's in this anthology. It's called Trail of Madness, and it's basically going to be just for the Western uh, field itself. And then I have another novel that's going to be coming out. Well, I don't know when it's going to be coming out. Just I just shipped it off to the agent today, but it is it's a Western, traditional Western completely, and it's the first time that I've written a just a straightforward traditional Western, and it is also the very first time I realized that I'd written a story in first person, and so it has been it's been really fun, and that one is one that I'm really hoping to see it get to do some neat things. Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah, first person is fun. I've done a few things in first person, although generally it's a little bit of a problem because you always have to check your tenses when you're writing first person.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap the interview up here. And I'd like to thank you both for being a guest today. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you
Well,
very much.
thank you.
We really
And
appreciate you.
yeah, and that's it for this episode. And bye for now, everybody.